All right, good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to the 32nd anniversary of Miami Book Fair. My name's LaSelve Harrison, and I'm a volunteer room host, and I'll be in this room with you here this morning and a little bit later on this afternoon. First of all, I'd like to just welcome you all, let you all know that Miami-Dade College, as a convener of the book fair, is really excited to have all of you here. It's a great turnout, and year in and year out, your continued contributions makes the book fair possible. If you've looked through the schedule of events for today, you've seen that we're going to have numerous author events, both within this building, across the hall, Children's Alley, the porch, the swamp. It's basically a fun-filled day, so make sure you get out and really try to get to as many events as possible. I'd like to also ask you to please consider becoming a friend of the book fair. Your charitable contribution it's really important to keep this book fair going on year after year. As a friend of the book fair, you're going to receive multiple benefits, special Friends of the Book Fair events, also special access and special seating at other events we have going on. This year, we've actually made supporting the book fair even easier. On your mobile phone, you can just text book to 501-501. They'll send you a confirmation text message, and if you could just reply, again, all of your contributions really go a long way to making this event possible. I'd like to also thank some of our sponsors, the Knight Foundation, OHL Ariano, and the Bachelor Foundation. There are also many other sponsors who you're going to see their names and their logos listed across signage across the book fair, and we just want to extend our thanks to all of them. Miami Book Fair also does not end today. I know this is a big culmination weekend, but throughout the year we have different events going on, so please continue to follow us on social media and keep apprised of all the events we have going on throughout the year. The authors are going to give a brief presentation, and then after that there'll be about a 10 to 15 minute Q&A session. Following the Q&A session, there's going to be a table outside where the author's books will be available for purchase, and then you can also go down and there'll be an autographing area session. Just in case we don't get to all the questions, you can ask them some other questions that you may have. Now I'd like to just ask everyone to either silence or vibrate your cell phones so that we can begin. And here with us today to introduce our authors is Michael Bolden, who's the editorial director at the Knight Foundation. Please join me in welcoming. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Michael Bolden. I'm a founding member of the Miami Book Fair's Literati Society, the editorial director of the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, who is a premier sponsor of Miami Book Fair and the sponsor of this panel. Welcome to True Tales of Three Cities. In our session today, the work of our three authors crosses the Americas, exploring three great cities, Rio de Janeiro, Detroit, and Los Angeles. Our first author, Juliana Barbassa, was born in Brazil, but she had a nomadic life between her home country and Iraq, Malta, Libya, Spain, and France before settling in the United States. She began her career with the Dallas Observer, where she won a Katie Journalism Award in 1999. She joined the Associated Press in 2003 and returned to Brazil in 2010 as the AP's Rio de Janeiro correspondent. Her debut book is Dancing with the Devil in the City of God, Rio de Janeiro on the Brink. It's a deeply reported and beautiful biography of the seductive and chaotic city. David Maraniss is an associate editor at the Washington Post and a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. His books include First in His Class, a biography of Bill Clinton, Rome, 1960, the Olympics that stirred the world, Barack Obama, the story, and Clemente, the passion and grace of baseball's last hero. David's latest book is Once in a Great City, a Detroit story. It was 1963 in Detroit, and the time was full of promise. The auto industry was selling more cars than ever before, and Motown was capturing the world with its amazing artists. But Once in a Great City shows that the shadows of collapse were evident even then. Detroit, at its peak, was threatened by its own design, but much of what it gave us endures. Les Standiford is the best-selling author of more than 20 books and novels, including the John Diehl Mystery Series and the works of narrative history, The Man Who Invented Christmas, and Last Train to Paradise. Les is the director of the creative writing program at Florida International University. In his book, Water to the Angels, William Mulholland, His Monumental Aqueduct, and the Rise of Los Angeles, Les tells the story of the largest public water project ever created. The Los Angeles Aqueduct carried water 223 miles from the Sierra Nevada mountains to Los Angeles, allowing a small desert city to grow into a modern metropolis. Les captures the breathtaking scope of this project that would transform a region, a state, and a nation. At a time when the importance of water is being recognized as never before, Water to the Angel sheds critical light on a past that offers insights for our future. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let the true tales of three cities begin. Les, take it away.
Thank you very much for that. Pleasure to be here. Thank you all for coming. I'm very pleased and honored to be up here with in this tall cotton. I used to think that if you were lucky enough to have published, written a book, completed it, and found a publisher for it, then what you would do would be to retire to your chambers and write another book. But I found out that that's not how it works. They like you to, the publisher that is, like you to go out and help sell the thing. And it's not that I mind coming to nice places like this and meeting with folks who actually have an interest in the things that I do, but sometimes it goes further than that. When Last Train to Paradise was about to be published, for instance, tells the story of the building of the Overseas Railroad from Miami to Key West, I got a call from the publicity director at Random House, a man named Brandon Perlberg. He said, "Les, good news." I said, "What's that?" He said, "There's a good chance we can get you on one of the morning news shows with this book." And I said, "Good." And he said, "But." You come to understand there's always a but with these things. I said, "What is it, Brandon?" He said, "Well, they want a news angle." I said, "A news angle? Most of this stuff happened about 100 years ago." He said, "Yeah, but they need a news angle, so get back to me when you've come up with one." What I did was retire to my chambers and try to come up with a news angle for that material. And to tell you the truth, I didn't do a very good job of it, but I was bound and determined to prove that given half a chance, I could have an interesting conversation with Charlie Gibson. They'd let it slip by then that we were talking about Good Morning America, and he was still the editor, and he was a reader, and an interested reader. Seemed to read all the books that he had, that had been written by the authors he had on. And so I retired to my chambers and wrote the script of my interview with Charles Gibson on Good Morning America, just in case it should not happen. Well, to tell you the truth, it never did happen. But I was so happy with the way that fictitious interview turned out that I took it with me everywhere I went on the book tour, and it started a tradition. I've interviewed with Charlie Gibson on every one of my books since. It's just that he doesn't know it. So, if you'd be willing to grant me that time-honored favor of the suspension of your disbelief, and imagine that I'm up here in the middle of a big television screen, the next voice that you will hear right after the morning news anchor has completed the breathless recap of Bruce Jenner's decisions to be everything that he can be, and the Levitra commercial has faded softly away, the next voice you will hear will be that of Charles Gibson, still an anchorman, still reading books, and still interviewing intrepid authors. As temperatures continue to rise in Los Angeles, a record 130 degrees this past September, and wildfires envelop more residential property, the prospect of a serious long-term drought becomes more likely. There were storms in February that dumped several inches of water on the ground, but the real source of year-round water in the region comes from the Sierra Nevada snowpack, and there has not been enough snow this winter to replenish that source, which was yielding about 10% of normal last summer. Governor Jerry Brown has, in fact, issued the first mandatory water use restrictions for the entire state. And while the water crisis in California heightens, a new book takes readers on a journey to the early years of the 20th century when Los Angeles, then a dusty outpost, first began to grapple with the question of how to keep from drying up into oblivion. With us to share the story of how Californians responded to their first brush with drought's catastrophe is Les Standiford, author of Water to the Angels. William Mulholland, his monumental aqueduct, and the rise of Los Angeles. And there you have the really nice thing about being a writer. If you're not happy with your reality, you can just redo it. Question, or should I say Charlie? Les, you wrote 10 novels before you turned to several recent works of nonfiction. What drew you away from making it all up into history? Answer. Well, Charlie, these stories I've been telling seem just as good as anything I might have made up. In fact, if you'd actually had me on your show back when Last Train to Paradise came out, you'd remember what I told you then. One of the richest men in the world undertakes the engineering challenge of the century, and the worst hurricane in history blows it all away. That seemed to me to be a lot better story than one about how an investment banker steals all his clients' money and builds himself a really big house. In the present case, there are some significant parallels. William Mulholland, a penniless Irish immigrant who'd never gone to high school and much less taken any coursework in engineering, designed and built the impossible Los Angeles aqueduct between 1907 and 1913, moving an entire river from the mountains of Central California 235 miles southward to Los Angeles, over deserts, across chasms, and through more mountains. Los Angeles had about 100,000 citizens at the time Mulholland began his work, and had been in the grip of a drought for a dozen years or so. The place was tapped out in terms of its water supply and seemed destined to stay just one more dusty town along the coast until Mulholland brought the water. Today, of course, Los Angeles has become one of the most important cities in the world, with 10 million or more living in its basins. Question. Well, if Mulholland pulled that off, why aren't we more familiar with him today? Answer. That's a good question, Charlie. Of course, a lot of people know Mulholland Drive, the spectacular road that runs along the crest of the Hollywood Hills, and there's actually a Mulholland Middle School in LA and some other things. But you're right in that Mulholland himself doesn't get a lot of press these days. Part of it has to do with what I like to call the Chinatown syndrome. Question. You're talking about the Academy Award-winning film that stars Jack Nicholson and Faye Dunaway. Answer. It is a classic and one of my favorites. And the film uses what are sometimes called the California Water Wars as an historical backdrop. But in the movie, the fictional character of Water Commissioner Hollis Mulray is a stand-in for William Mulholland, and he is portrayed as a colorless pipsqueak who is easily dispatched by powerful bad guy developer Noah Cross, who's played by John Huston. So far as the real history of LA is concerned, though, the film doesn't have much correspondence to what took place, actually. Chinatown is set in the 1930s, for one thing. Mulholland did the bulk of his work between 1905 and 1915. And while the subplot of the movie suggests that there was a conspiracy between businessmen such as Noah Cross and the city to build the aqueduct and line the pockets of the corrupt, there is no evidence that's ever been uncovered to support such charges. Question. Mulholland was never convicted of taking a bribe? Answer. He was honest to a fault. All he ever got out of building the aqueduct was his civil servant salary, which was bumped up to $15,000 a year as he was doing the work. Politicians came to him in the aftermath of the aqueduct's completion and asked him, please, to run for mayor. He was the most popular individual in Los Angeles at the time and could have won in a walk. His response was typical Mulholland. Mayor, I'd rather give birth to a porcupine backward. Harrison Gray Otis, publisher of the LA Times, his son-in-law Harry Chandler, a developer named Moses Sherman, and others did buy up property in the San Fernando Valley in advance of the aqueduct's completion. And they did profit, but that had nothing to do with Mulholland. He decried such speculation. But as he also said, show me a place to bring the water where somebody doesn't own the land. All Mulholland cared about was bringing water to a place that he had fallen in love with. He came to LA and started work as a ditch digger in the 1870s when there were only a few thousand residents and disputes were still being settled by shootouts in the street. He worked himself up to become the superintendent of the private company that sold the city its water, and when the city bought the company out, they brought Mulholland, the brains of the outfit, along with it. So where did the idea come from, diverting the Owens River all the way from up by the Mammoth Ski Basin, east of San Francisco? Answer, Mulholland gave credit to a former mayor of LA, Fred Eaton, who had floated the idea of using Owens Valley water to irrigate lands down by Mojave, not far from Death Valley, as early as 1892. But until Mulholland and Eaton took a legendary buckboard trip up into the Sierras and Mulholland pronounced the concept feasible, no one took the idea seriously. It would be like Washington, D.C. tapping into the Ohio River for its drinking water, one federal engineer said. Question, was the project an easy sell for Mulholland? Answer, just the opposite. A lot of people thought it could not be done, and others believed the price of $22 million was too high, but Mulholland had turned the city's water company into a money-making concern that delivered what it promised. In the end, voters were won over by the chief, and the truth is that he had some that same larger-than-life persona that bad guy Noah Cross projects in the movie Chinatown. It is just that Mulholland was honest. So how did the actual building go? Such a thing had never been done before. And the work took place literally in terra incognita. It was hard to keep laborers going, and the physical challenges were unprecedented. Mulholland admitted we would have never finished if it weren't for whiskey. But he also came up with a number of novel engineering techniques that had never been thought of, including the construction of massive steel siphons that were 80 to 100 inches in diameter, carry the pipes down one side of a huge canyon and up the next side without pumps. There are no pumps in the entire 235-mile-long aqueduct. Only gravity moves the water. Pumping would have been far too expensive. And Mulholland laid out the entire route using a surveyor's compass and a barometer. In the end, though there were a number of casualties, the work came in on time and under budget, using only city employees. Imagine proposing such a concept today. You'd call him a hero, I'm guessing? Answer, I'd call him larger than life, that's for sure. But there's a tragic turn to Mulholland's story. In 1928, the St. Francis Dam that he designed and built in 1926 to store some aqueduct water burst. The flood sent a wall of water some 60 miles all the way to the Pacific and killed more than 600 people. It remains today one of the worst disasters in California history, second only to the San Francisco earthquake and fire of 1906. At the coroner's inquest called to assign blame, Mulholland, then 72, said this, "If human error was involved, then I'm the human. Fasten the blame on me." It was a rare stance for a public official, but that is the kind of man he was. In the end, no blame was assigned to any individual, and engineering experts debate to this day the cause of the dam's collapse. So what is the legacy of William Mulholland then? That he, a self-trained engineer motivated by what he felt was best for those around him, designed and completed a project that changed the world to an extent that could scarcely have been imagined at the time. His example of ingenuity, selflessness, dedication, and achievement is about as grand as it gets. Question, were he here alive today, what question might you ask him? Answer, I'd say, Mr. Mulholland, we're about to run out of water in California again. What do you think we ought to do? Charlie, I wish you were here to answer. Thanks for being on the show, Les. I wish we'd had you on a lot sooner. My pleasure, Charlie.
Thank you, Les, for that treat. Juliana, will you take us to Rio?
Hello, and thank you for being here today. Bear with me, I have a cough, so if I break out, I'll be back. As was said here earlier, I'm a journalist, and I've lived in 8 countries and well over a dozen cities. But I always had a very special relationship to Rio. I think Rio de Janeiro is a fascinating city, no matter who you are. It has an image that grabs people. But before I get into the book and the city itself, I want to read you a little bit about my connection to the city. You know, what drew me back to it eventually. I was 3 years old when my family first left Brazil, following the whims of my father's job. For the next 7 years or so, we moved around the Middle East and the Mediterranean, changing cities more often than many families change cars. This hopscotching left me a perennial outsider, a bookish kid with glasses and a halo of curly hair who spoke a home-baked Portuguese sprinkled with English and Arabic and felt out of place anywhere but in a library. My sense of the country named on my passport was patched together from conversations, the outdated magazines that reached us, and yearly visits to our vast extended family when I'd lose myself among dozens of cousins, watching and listening, trying to grasp what it meant to be Brazilian. Each time we landed in Rio, there would be a moment when we left the airport when I'd roll down the taxi window and let in the city's humid embrace. It was the first sign I was home. In these visits, I'd take in my fill of the hothouse atmosphere, letting it gush through my senses. After the spare vistas of the Middle East, with their limited palette of sand, stone, and sky, I always returned hungry for Rio, where green shoots pushed from every crack and thick-petaled flowers bloomed year-round, saturated with color and rich with scent. The people thronging the streets, bare-chested men and women in short, tight everything, walked with a fluid grace as if on well-oiled joints. They talked a lot and laughed out loud, the rounded vowels of Brazilian Portuguese tumbling out like marbles. After a year surrounded by the discreet monochrome of Muslim women's concealing chadors and the men's loose jalabias, the physical exuberance and informality of Brazilians was always shocking at first. This was a place where life happened at close range. The apartments were small, stuffed with too many relatives, and breathless on hot afternoons. So much of what happened in private elsewhere was conducted outdoors in Rio. People kissed, drank, danced, even groomed themselves in full view. Accustomed as I was to the high walls and modesty of Muslim society, the people of Rio de Janeiro, the cariocas as they're called, seemed almost obscene and entirely fascinating. But our visits were always too short, and before I could grasp what it meant to be of this place, we were on our way to the airport again. So it was on this basis that I grew up always visiting, once a year, visiting family, and always following Rio de Janeiro and Brazil in the newspapers. I grew up this way. I became a journalist this way. I covered other countries. And I always followed Brazil and Rio specifically. And over the years, I started to notice that something was happening, something particular was happening to this country that I thought I knew so well. It was moving from the back pages of newspapers, where it would only appear in a case of a tremendous natural disaster or violence or maybe a presidential election, to the front pages. It was suddenly the bee in bricks, on its way to becoming one of the world's largest economies. It was at one point the sixth largest economy in the world. And this country of tremendous inequality, a country marked essentially by inequality, one of the most unequal in the world, was seeing a tremendous expansion of its middle class. The number that I always like to go back to is a population the size of California in a period of just 10 years went from being poor to being middle class. This is tremendous change involving a lot of people. There are elements to it that promised that this wasn't temporary. For example, a huge discovery of oil off of Rio de Janeiro's coast, so large that it prompted the president at the time to say that God is Brazilian. We're talking money to substantially change some of the biggest areas of need for Brazilians, to bring education to more people, to bring health insurance, health coverage. So we were talking about a big transformation in a place that had been a backwater, so to speak, for a very long time. I watched all of this, not just as a Brazilian who had this deep personal connection to the place, but as a journalist. I like good stories. This was a good story. And I was watching very closely when Brazil was awarded the chance to host the 2014 World Cup, which meant it was a huge deal for Brazilians. As you know, Brazil's the country of soccer, nothing that people love more. But particularly when Rio de Janeiro was chosen in 2009 to host the Olympics that are going to happen next year, 2016. And I watched this moment in particular because the Olympics have been used in the past as a way of giving a sort of international stamp of approval on a country. When an economy is up and coming, China, Korea, this is something that is used to say, you know, the world's behind you. We believe that you've tackled a lot of your issues and you can tackle some of the ones that are left. And I had substantial questions about that. Of course, you know, Brazil and Rio in particular has some very deep challenges. In addition to the inequality that I mentioned, security, for example. This was one of the most mentioned words in Rio de Janeiro's Olympic bid. This was something that was going to have to be tackled if the city were to welcome the world, welcome millions of tourists. Environment, the second most mentioned word in Rio de Janeiro's bid. There are tremendous issues with pollution in the very waters where Olympic competitions would be held. Sailing would be held in the big bay that's at the heart of metropolitan Rio, for example, and a bay that receives 480 swimming pools worth of raw sewage every day. So very substantial issues that would have to be taken on. And I also had some questions, again, as a Brazilian and as a journalist that's used to fact-checking. What does it mean that more than 30 million people have emerged from poverty into middle class? What does this really look like? What does it mean for the lives of those people that we're talking about? What do they have now that they didn't have before? And so I wanted to see this up close. And I'm going to read to you another little section. I'll intersperse my reading and talking to talk about some of the questions that I had. But what did all this mean? From afar, the whole thing seemed to veer between a well-founded optimism and a giddy, sky's-the-limit euphoria. Good news came in daily and by the handful. For the first time in generations, there was money and political will to push through substantial reforms. The World Cup and the Olympics gave Brazil, and Rio in particular, concrete deadlines and a long to-do list. Social and economic change was transforming the landscape and the expectations of the population. This was a unique experiment, and the results mattered, not just to me as a Brazilian, but to me as a reporter. Urban chaos, poverty, pollution, and an indifferent state were not exclusive to Rio. Other megacities in the developing world face these same challenges. Would Rio find original answers within the high-pressure crucible of the next few years, or would it crack in unforeseen ways? There's a Brazilian expression for something that's only a facade, para inglês ver, or for the English to see. It comes from the years after England abolished slavery and campaigned to end the human trade. Brazil signed an international treaty and passed a law promising to stop, but the traffic continued. The laws were meant for the English to see, a nicety for foreign eyes. Would the changes of the next few years be just for the English to see, or were we looking at a transformation that would go to the core, reforming the violence and the inequality that had historically hobbled the city? Whatever the case, I didn't want to just read about it in the news. I applied to be the Associated Press's Rio de Janeiro correspondent and got the job. Within 3 weeks, I rented out my apartment, sold my car, gave away my books. On November 4th, 2010, I checked into the United Airlines counter in San Francisco with a one-way ticket to Brazil. After 21 years abroad, I was going home. And as I mentioned, I went home not just with the real hope and the expectations that I had as a Brazilian that I feel I shared with a lot of Brazilians and even a lot of people watching Brazil from abroad, but with very specific questions. As a journalist, used to holding authorities accountable and looking to fact-check some of the specific promises that were made in connection to the Olympic bid, but also things that were generally tied to it. And, some of these things were relevant to those who were going to watch the Olympics, relevant to those who wanted to come to Brazil for the Olympics, but very, very important to the lives of those who live there as well, who are the ones who suffer the most immediate consequences. And one of the first issues that I wanted to look at, I intended to look at, also sort of came and grabbed me as soon as I arrived. This was security. Rio de Janeiro, over a couple of decades, since the 1980s, had vast swaths of the city, vast areas covered in favelas. These are communities where the working poor live. Essentially, people build their own tiny shacks on the hillsides, and these areas have been largely abandoned by the state over generations. What happened was that in the 80s, when drug dealing gangs started to make more money with the onset of cocaine, as cocaine came to town, they took over these vast communities. They essentially began to control great parts of town, and they controlled the boundaries of this. Nobody could go in, people providing services, but also the police. So it meant that these gangs were allowed to grow and grow wealthy, grow powerful within these protected areas. They could go out, hit the city, and come back. Well, just as I arrived, the Rio State, with an eye to these oncoming sports events, had implemented a security program that was supposed to tackle this situation for the first time in my lifetime. They had developed this program that implemented 24-hour police patrols within some of these communities. The police would invade, in some cases with the help of the armed forces, would take over the community and would implement police bases within the community. I arrived just as the most powerful drug dealing gang in Rio decided to push back against this, decided to reassert their power. They were doing this by taking passenger cars at random, telling the driver to get out and essentially torching the car and leaving the car to burn in a public street and snarl traffic and spread chaos and panic. They started to do this with buses. So this started on my second day on the job. I was absolutely flabbergasted. I had not expected this. I had come with these tremendous expectations of improvement. It was a real shock, and it was part of my job to cover this. And so I followed as the state police decided that the way to deal with this was to crack down, to invade the headquarters of the main drug dealing gang, the Red Command, the Comando Vermelho. This was a vast complex of favelas of over 100,000 people, families living there, but that was under control of this drug gang. So it was a residential area with heavily armed gangsters about to be invaded by the police with the aid of the armed forces. Essentially a war scenario within a city that was not technically at war. And so I proceeded to tell the story for the Associated Press, and it's the story that opens the book for me because it was such an eye-opening experience into the lives of the people there. And I tell the story through various actors. Myself, having just arrived, the police chief coordinating all of this, a man who had his lifetime marked by defeats to this drug gang, so he took this very personally. A gangster who was high up in these hills, second in command in this most powerful drug gang, a man who had been completely in control of this terrain up until that moment, and that gangster's mother, who ran a commercial kitchen just outside the favela. So I'm going to read to you just a little section to give you a sense of, again, the what it felt to be there at that time in these years. Sorry, wrong page. 3 blocks away from the hospital, inside a metal pod that served as her commercial kitchen, Dona Nilza moved her ample body closer to the television that sat above her refrigerator. Her eyesight forced her to squint an arm's length from the screen, to follow as the police stormed Vila Cruzeiro. It was from this tin can space that she ran a van line, the extraofficial transportation that served communities such as this one and made lunch for the drivers. A small plastic fan chopped at the air, swirling the steam around and stirring the tired pages of the Bible that always lay open behind the counter. On calmer mornings, neighborhood kids ran in for a kiss and some candy, calling out, "Dona Nilza." Not that Thursday. The children were locked indoors, and Dona Nilza's thoughts turned to her own child. To the police, the conglomeration of favelas was a fortress bristling with enemy soldiers. To people like Dona Nilza, it was home. These alleys, now swarming with men in flak jackets, were playgrounds for their kids. She'd brought up 10 children in Alemão, all of them crammed into a narrow 3-story house where rooms had sprouted organically one on top of the other as the family grew. She'd reared them all on money from the van line and the teachings of the Assembly of God Evangelical Church, then set them loose in the world to find their way. They'd all chosen the straight and narrow path, all except Diego, her second youngest. She'd lost him to the life, as she put it, when he was a tall, spindly 16-year-old, timid for all his size. That was 9 years ago. He'd be 25 now. He was up there somewhere. That was why, when police and the army charged up the hill, she watched so closely. The bodies come down wrapped in sheets, she said. You can always see the feet sticking out. That was my biggest fear, recognizing my son by his feet. So she watches, and all of Rio and all of Brazil at this point watch as police stormed the bunker at the foot of the hills and got ready to take the entire community. As police approached, cameras captured drug dealers running off and trying to escape. The image that brought to mind was roaches. I mean, just a swarm of them trying to take off as police surrounded the area. And she watched for over the next few days as they got ready to storm the core of the community where her son was. And she made a decision. I'm going to read you one last little section that talks about that. Dona Nilza had seen law enforcement take over one of the gang's most important bases of operations. Diego had survived that first assault. She didn't know where he was hiding, but those scenes of gangsters on the run played over and over on TV. Dona Nilza knew that favelas were no longer a safe haven for men like him. Walking past the favela complex, she eyed the police chokehold, the tanks grumbling at the bottom of the hill, the yard-long weapons soldiers held with both hands. She called on her God and weighed her options, praying and fasting, begging for a light. She had 9 other children, plus grandchildren and great-grandchildren. They all depended on her. But she had one son who needed her the most. That Saturday morning, she was back to work in her kitchen, although there were few customers for her prepared lunches. Van drivers were also staying home from the conflict. Taped to the metal siding behind her stove, right next to where it said double portions, was a poster printed with Psalm 29:11. The Lord will give strength unto his people. The Lord will bless his people with peace. She made up her mind. She shrugged off the lifetime of worry that rounded her shoulders and untied the heavy-duty plastic apron. She would find Diego. I couldn't stand by and watch my son come down wrapped in a sheet, she said, returning to the image that haunted her. She called up 3 of her other sons, one of them an evangelical pastor, and told them it was time. Essentially, she decides to go up. She finds him. She gets past police, convinces him to turn himself in, brings him down, finds a police officer she trusts, because the police are also very untrustworthy. The police in Rio is very brutal, very lethal. That year, they killed nearly 500 people. He turns himself in, serves time in prison, and in a twist that really could only happen in Rio, he was a tall, athletic young man, and when he turned himself in and all the journalists convened, all the photographers convened and took those pictures of him, in his handcuffs, looking very tough, he caught the eye of a clothing brand, essentially. He was wearing a shirt. And more people called that clothing brand about that shirt, about their brand, after this handsome, athletic young man was arrested in it, than had called when, actors had worn it. And so they asked him if he wanted to be their model, and he did. And so for him, there was a very positive outcome to this. But not so much for the rest of Rio. In the book, I chronicle how this experiment with security starts to go wrong. The drug gangs eventually start to push back, start to kill police officers. The number of people killed by police begins to go back up, even as Brazil and Rio de Janeiro host the World Cup and now prepare to host the Olympics. I talk about other issues as well, the pollution that was so important for the games and for the population. There was a very specific promise made to clean that bay at the center of Rio by 80% before the games started. And earlier this year, the governor of Rio admitted that this will not happen. And in fact, the Associated Press did a big exploration of this issue and tested the waters and found that the bacterial count and the viral count was very, very high and a risk to athletes. And of course, as I'd been saying before, and as I say in the book, a tremendous risk for the population as a whole. And so through the book, I essentially look at what it means, what these years meant, that the economy going up, the access to credit, the access to money that so many people didn't have, these hopes for improvement that were sometimes tied to specific programs, sometimes tied to tremendous expectations that were built up by hosting these games, and the ways in which they begin to crack. They essentially begin to fail the population and the world's expectations at large. And I take the readers all the way to the World Cup that happened in Brazil and was preceded to tremendous surprise by a lot of people, including journalists, academics, observers, the politicians at the highest level. Brazilians broke into tremendous protest right before the World Cup. Hundreds of thousands of people took the streets calling for a government that met their needs instead of building more stadiums and more venues. And I feel like the international press in general started to pay attention to what is it about these games? What is it that, what benefits do they actually bring to the population, and at what cost? I think Rio has been a tremendous contributor to that, and I feel, earlier this year I was in Boston, and the population of Boston, to a great degree, was opposed to hosting the Olympic Games. I feel like because of some of these things that we've been hearing. So in this book, I essentially take the reader in and show them one place, what the expectations were, what the promises were, and what it meant to go through this roller coaster. And what it meant for me as a Brazilian. But thank you so much.
Thanks, Juliana. We appreciate that. Now, we ask you to please stay as David Maraniss takes us to Detroit. Detroit has been a night community since 1940, and we're extremely interested in his story. David Maraniss.
Thank you. It's Maraniss. That's all right. There's barely any time left. I feel like I should do Hamlet in 5 minutes. But like Juliana, this is sort of a story of home in some ways. I have to be obsessed to write a book. I've written 11 books. This is my 11th. And this obsession came to me in the strangest of ways. It was Super Bowl Sunday on 2011. I was in New York City at a bar watching the Green Bay Packers play. And at halftime, I looked up at the screen and saw a commercial and a freeway sign that said Detroit. And then I saw all of these iconic images of the city. The Joe Louis Fist downtown, the great Diego Rivera murals of Detroit industry at the Detroit Institute of Arts, the sculpture, The Spirit of Detroit, and then this black sedan riding up Woodward Avenue, and seeing Eminem in the car. I'm too old to be an Eminem guy, but there was this wonderful hypnotic backbeat. And he gets out of the car at the glorious Fox Theater and walks in. There's a black gospel choir rising in song. And Eminem turns to the camera and says, "This is the Motor City, and this is what we do." By the end of that, I was choked up. I literally had tears in my eyes. And my wife, more pragmatic, later said to me, "David, why did you fall for that? They're just selling Chryslers." And Detroit's kind of a mess, which is very true, both of those things. But it got me thinking about why it struck me that way. I was born in Detroit at Women's Hospital in 1949. My earliest primordial memories are of that city, of Verner's ginger ale, so strong it goes up your nostrils, of the Hudson's department store downtown where my mother worked at Christmas, of the Boblo boat, of taking a bus down to the Fisher Y as a 6-year-old and swimming naked with the other little boys in a freezing swimming pool. And all of these memories washed over me as I watched that commercial and got me thinking about the city from which I came and how I could honor it. I'm a writer. I wanted to write about this city. I'm not a financial writer. There are other people who could write about the bankruptcy, but I wanted to write about what Detroit gave America, which is an enormous amount. Not just the obvious of automobiles, but also Motown, the soundtrack of my generation, labor and the United Auto Workers. Detroit is the heart of the American labor movement. And also civil rights. In the 1960s, Detroit was at the center of pushing the civil rights movement in so many ways. And that took me to a specific period of time to write about. My sort of metaphor I use about the reporting and writing I do is to set up an oil rig somewhere and dig down as deeply as I can. And to get those four strong elements of what Detroit gave America into my book, I centered on 18 months in the early 1960s, from October of 1962 to May of 1964. In October of 1962, in the same week, the Detroit Auto Show introduced the cars that would sell more than ever before in history. And also during that period, in secret in Dearborn, Ford Motor Company was conceiving the Mustang, the sort of sexy car of the 60s. And that same week, the first Motortown Review left Detroit, left West Grand Boulevard, taking the music of Motown to the country. An incredible busload of little Stevie Wonder at age 13, Marvin Gaye, Smokey Robinson and the Miracles, Mary Wells, Martha Vandellas, The Temptations singing backup for Mary Wells, and an opening act called The Supremes that nobody was sure would make it or not yet. That was Motown in 1962. In the middle of that year, in June 23rd, 1963, Martin Luther King came to Detroit. He was invited there by Aretha Franklin's father, Reverend C.L. Franklin, the most colorful preacher in Detroit, the preacher of the streets at New Bethel Baptist Church. This was the summer of civil rights in the spring. Earlier that spring, Martin Luther King and his followers had been sicked on by police dogs and hoses in Birmingham. And it was the United Auto Workers, led by Walter Reuther in Detroit, that bailed most of those protesters out of jail. Reverend Franklin invited King to come to Detroit for a fundraiser and rally. 150,000 people gathered on walked down Woodward Avenue that day, the largest civil rights rally to that point in history, and gathered at Cobo Hall down by the river, where Martin Luther King delivered his first major public version of the I Have a Dream speech. He did it in Detroit first. And 1 month later, a black prostitute on John R. was shot in the back by police. And all of this great goodwill that had been built up in that moment of the speech, when the police commissioner had actually greeted Martin Luther King at the airport and said there'll be no police dogs here, when he walked with Martin Luther King, when the mayor Jerome Kavanaugh walked with King, when Walter Reuther did. 1 month later, a shooting in Detroit, sort of an early variation of Ferguson this year, happened in Detroit, and things in a sense started to unravel. Racial tension had been a serious problem in Detroit for decades, going back to World War II, when one of the major race riots in American history happened in Detroit, a fight over housing and jobs between largely Appalachian whites who worked in the auto industry and the African Americans. But there was still this notion of great promise in Detroit, this creative energy going on with the auto industry, with Motown, and this tension at the same time. I talk in the book about the central tension between creativity and creation and decay and destruction. And even as Detroit was booming in all those ways, you could see the structural problems were already there before the riots of 1967, before the major pension problems, before the corrupt mayors. Detroit was already struggling in 1963 at this moment when it was an incandescent star, but also a dying star. Some sociologists at Wayne State University issued a report that spring that said that Detroit was on its way to losing 500,000 people by the end of the 1960s decade. And that depopulation would continue into the foreseeable future, stripping the city of its tax base, which essentially is what happened. Near the end of this book, the Mustang comes out, introduced at the World's Fair in New York City. I was a 14-year-old there. I remember walking up to the Coke Pavilion, or Pepsi Pavilion, and ordering a Coke, just sort of unwittingly. But I also rode in the first Mustang, which was at the Ford Wonder Rotunda. And then a month later, this is May of 1964, Lyndon Johnson arrived in Detroit, declared it the Herald of Hope in America, on his way to Ann Arbor. John Kennedy was supposed to go to Ann Arbor to deliver the commencement address at the University of Michigan. He had a long-standing history with Detroit. In 1960, Kennedy had started his campaign in Detroit. It was there that he delivered the first variation of his most famous lines, "Ask not what your country can do for you." It wasn't quite as poetic. He didn't start it with "ask not," but it was the same lines otherwise. So to think that the most famous address of the 20th century, "I Have a Dream," and the most famous inaugural lines were both issued in Detroit first. Kennedy, of course, was assassinated in November of '63, so he was not able to go to the commencement at Michigan. Lyndon Johnson came instead, and after declaring Detroit the Herald of Hope for America, he took a helicopter to Michigan, and it was there that he delivered his Great Society address. All of that promise, that's where the book ends, that wistful moment, thinking about what we know, what happened to Detroit over the coming decades. The characters in the book don't know. I've been to Detroit 12 times since starting the book. I joke at the beginning that I felt that I could, on my way to the Walter Reuther archives from a little bed and breakfast, the Inn on Ferry Street, where I would go every day, I felt I could sit down in the middle of Woodward Avenue and read War and Peace and not get hit by a car. Every time I've gone back, I've felt more and more energy. 4 times since the book came out, you see the downtown starting to boom in some interesting ways. Of course, rich people are investing in it and want to make money off it, but they're bringing restaurants and jobs into the downtown. The Midtown area has sort of a sensibility of a little Brooklyn in a way. You know, foodies and artists and techies are coming in. This, of course, creates a certain amount of tension from people who feel that they're left behind. There's still vast swaths of Detroit that are desolate. The first day of my book tour, I met Kai Risdall of NPR's Marketplace, and he said, "Let's go out to the flat you lived in when you were 6 years old." We drove out there, and the house had just been torn down. And 5 out of the 8 houses on that block were gone. So there's a lot of work to do in Detroit, but you start to feel some measure of hope again. It's gone from a city of ruin to a city of hope. And I say that the most important word in my book, in the title of my book, is in. Once in a great city. It's not once a great city, not once upon a great city, but once in a great city, because Detroit, in so many ways, is and can be a great city. Thank you very much.
Thank you again to our wonderful authors. At this time, we're going to have a Q&A session. There are mics in this aisle and this aisle here, so if you just step up to the microphone and ask your question. Go ahead.
David, I remember regarding the Detroit cars that came out when I was a kid growing up, and every year it was such an excitement to see the styles of the cars. And in your research, were you able to pinpoint, when exactly did the designers and the management of the motor industry, stop expecting the kind of sizzle every year with the car styles that, when you and I were kids, that they had?
Is this on? Yes. It happened a little later than my book, obviously. The Mustang was the sexy car of the 60s. The Buick Riviera came out that year, too, for the first time. 2 incredibly stylish cars in very different ways. But it wasn't until by 1970, the Mustang had gotten fat. Everything in my book dies in some way or another, sadly. Walter Reuther dies in a plane crash. Reverend Franklin, Aretha's father, is shot in his house by intruders. Motown leaves for Los Angeles, and the Mustang gets fat. So I would say it was about 1971 that this started to happen.
Go ahead, sir.
Question for Les. Why have people in the LA area use cisterns to collect rainwater when they really have rains good part of the season?
Well, they didn't grow up in Ohio, probably. Some people do, but the idea of having, and I know I've met some people out there in the course of writing this book who did have cisterns, but part of it just has to do with past practices and the money that it would cost and the difficulty and the lack of any. There is occasionally you'll see an editorial, what we need is cisterns, but you don't see much of that sort of thing. But geez, if Home Depot in Miami can have a cistern to collect water to keep its plants for sale watered, I don't see why Southern California couldn't do the same. You've got to understand, though, that only about between 15 and 18% of water usage in Southern California is domestic. Most of it is farming and industrial, far and away. That's what uses most of the water. And while Governor Brown's edicts about, the days of watering your little green lawn are over sound good, it's not really going to make much of a difference. I think the real answer is desalinization, but that's going to take a lot of time, cost a lot of money to get it to the point where it's going to make an effective difference.
Thanks.
Yes, go ahead.
It's a question about Detroit. I'm the president of the New World Symphony here in Miami. A good number of our graduates have moved on to the Detroit Symphony. Ken Parsons, who is the president of the Detroit Symphony, has come to speak to our fellows, and we spend a lot of time talking about the Detroit Symphony because it encountered its major problems. This was now 5, 6, 7 years ago. Our players would say to me, "Should I go audition for Detroit Symphony?" And I said, "Absolutely, because these guys hit the wall first.
Yes.
They're going to come out of this quicker than everybody else." I've just come back from a Global Cultural Districts Conference in London where we talked about, not just in the United States, but also in Asia and across Europe, how culture is going to influence the future of cities. And I'm curious to know how you see, Knight Foundation has done incredible contribution to the museum here in Detroit. How do you see culture helping Detroit bounce back? How will they rebuild, and how will culture be part of that?
Well, first of all, the Detroit Symphony just this week is performing this great Detroit concert, that's really vibrant and amazing and sort of captures the spirit of what's going on there now and its past. And the grand bargain that was, quote unquote grand bargain that brought Detroit out of its bankruptcy and resolved the pension problems, saved the art of Detroit. The Detroit Institute of Arts is one of the great art museums in America. A fabulous place with that Diego Rivera mural and many others that are absolutely priceless. Motown was the creative spirit of Detroit at one point. It left, but you see a lot of new music coming into Detroit and a lot of artists, and they have. I'm fascinated by why certain civilizations or cities have these creative bursts at different times. And for Detroit, in the book, I examine why that happened in the 1960s. A lot of different reasons having to do with public school music teachers, with pianos in the homes, all of these things that you don't really think about. Of course, the great migration of African Americans from the South, bringing their traditions of church music and jazz and blues. So that's what created in the 1960s. I think you see some of that same creative spirit in Detroit now because it's a place where you can invent yourself. It has that ability. There's no other pressures on people right now, and you need that sort of freedom to blossom, and you see it in 1,000 different ways in Detroit today. Thank you.
Yes, go ahead.
I just came back Labor Day weekend from attending the Detroit Jazz Festival, and I've been hearing about that for many, many years, and had never been. And I had several things. I had never been to Detroit before, and of course I had several destinations, of course, everything in that museum was amazing. Hitsville, USA, which I didn't get a chance to see because I got there at 12 noon and they said, no, we're all booked up to tours. But that was, having been a child of the 60s and grown up with Motown here in Miami, that's what it's all about. And what I found, no public transportation. I had
Yep.
to take Uber for the first time. A beautiful downtown area, clean, modern, and the friendliest people I have ever found in my travels. So there is a resurgence of people that the Midtown area is sort of like the Midtown here in Miami, that kind of renaissance. And another destination for my accompanying traveler, which was my 29-year-old son, they had to see the Shinola store. So my question is the feeling of the people of Detroit celebrating the music, 36 years of a free jazz festival with Charlie Hayden's Liberation Orchestra and just amazing museums. Music is the main draw in the city, I feel. But how do you see it coming up? There was a lot of optimism on the part of everybody in Detroit.
Yeah, well, the jazz history of Detroit is stunning. You know, so many great artists came out of jazz artists before Motown.
Right.
You know, 20 of the most famous jazz musicians in the world came out of Detroit in some way or another. And so that jazz festival is, you know, not as recognized as Newport or New Orleans, but it's up there and just as wonderful. Electronica music came out of Detroit, you know, a lot of music that I don't understand. That's wonderful, you know, a lot of different varieties of it. And I think that music is at the heart of Detroit. In the 1950s, it had the Flame Show Bar with all of the fabulous singers from Dinah Washington and Billie Holiday coming to Detroit, along with the jazz clubs. And now it's got all these other things going. Thank you.
I have a question for Juliana. Will President Rousseff make it through her term? And how much of this very large corruption scandal around Petrobras can be laid to her, and how much can actually be laid to Lula?
Well,
I don't know what the previous president was incredibly successful.
I was just going to give that little explanation. Part of Brazil's boom in the last few years has been attributed by some to the rise of the Workers' Party. The current president, the past president, were both members of this party, and they did put in place some very important social programs, welfare programs that really made a huge difference to a tremendous amount of Brazilians. 50 million people are now directly helped by one of them, 1/4 of the population. So very substantial. But the recent economic recession that Brazil has gone into, for reasons that are international as well as domestic, has really put a strain on this popularity of the current president and this party in particular. She reached a low point of 7% approval rating, huge. And this is part of what I think is so interesting and so fascinating about Brazil at this moment. It was a huge boom in the economy, politically stable. Everybody was betting on Brazil. Foreign direct investment was at record highs. It was really up and coming. And now we're looking at a president with a 7% approval rating. We're looking at a huge corruption scandal that ensnares not just the big oil company that was supposed to pump this oil, that was going to bring the money to make all these reforms, but also the political party that is governing and the opposition and the huge construction companies that are directly related to building the Olympic venues. So we're looking at the political and economic leadership of a country entangled in the biggest corruption scandal that we've ever known. So will she stay till the end of her term? I don't know. Brazilians can be somewhat unpredictable. I mentioned the massive street protests that led right up to the World Cup. Nobody had expected those. Now we've got less than a year to go until the Olympics. The Olympics are in August 2016. And so much can happen between now and then. We've seen some of the wealthiest men in Brazil, the most powerful men in Brazil, put behind bars. Now the investigation is getting closer and closer to the politicians. And I bet you the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, they're biting their fingers right now. They're biting their nails because few months to go and so much turmoil still to come. Who knows?
Hi, I'd like to ask all three of you to maybe project how you think your cities are going to look or what's going to happen to them in the near future. You know, one emerging from bankruptcy, one facing all these challenges with the Olympics coming up, and then less with, you know, drought, water shortages. I mean, if you guys had to look into the future, what do you think is going to happen to these cities?
Detroit, since it's in the decades of its decline, has had a few false starts where it looked like it was coming back. But those were always dependent entirely on the auto industry. And I think that the diversity in Detroit, the diversification of Detroit's new Detroit makes it a little less dependent on that. The auto industry has essentially left Detroit in so many ways, emotionally and financially. And Detroit is ahead of a lot of other cities in that it hit bottom first. So, you know, there are places from Chicago to even states that are going to deal with pension problems that Detroit has already resolved. So I think this is a real start. But as I've said forever, you can have this renaissance in the downtown and midtown, but until you start dealing with the people who built Detroit, in so many ways, the working class, and find ways to recover the housing and the jobs, it can't be a full recovery. But I'm as a journalist, I'm skeptical but optimistic.
Well, speaking about Rio de Janeiro, I think one of the things in our immediate future is the Olympics. And to judge from the way the World Cup was pulled off, when it actually happened, it was a tremendous party. There were thousands of people in the streets. I think the Olympics are going to be much the same in Rio. So that's a positive. There's a lot riding on this for the city. But I think one of the real questions for me, again, as a journalist and as a Brazilian, is at what cost is this coming? At what is the immediate cost for the population and the long-term cost? And I think that looking a bit more into the future, looking beyond the games, I think that cost is going to be very high. I think these games have left the city a far more unequal city than it was before, which is saying a lot in a place like Rio de Janeiro. You know, you've had removals of some of the poorest people in the city, pushed into the far outskirts. You're seeing the police, which is tremendously lethal. As I said, just last year, over 500 people were killed by the state of Rio police alone. These police are being heavily armed. There are going to be 80,000 police officers in the streets during the Olympic Games, making sure they're absolutely safe. Safest place in the world to be is going to be Rio de Janeiro during the Rio Olympics. But the question is afterwards, right? All of these guns, all of this weaponry given to a very brutal police force. What is the effect that this is going to have on the population at large? The transportation infrastructure being put in place, the social cleansing that's happening. I spend a lot of time with prostitutes in this book, and a lot of the places where they work are being shuttered. They're being pushed out to clean the face of the city before the world comes to visit. So they're going to be put into a more vulnerable situation, a more dangerous situation. So I think that the long-term consequences, especially for the most vulnerable population, are not going to be very pretty. And again, a city that was already known for being very unequal, I think is going to be pushed further in that direction.
I think that one of the most obvious changes that's going to take place in Los Angeles is cosmetic. It's going to start to look a lot more like Phoenix than New England. And for whatever reason, folks who've gone to Southern California have wanted to carry along with it their picket fences and their little green lawns. And unlike what happens in Tucson and Phoenix and other desert cities, I think it's going to start to look like a desert city, much more so. I also think that the pressure, the very practical pressure, is going to lead to an increased amount of research on desalinization. And I'm hoping that's the good that comes out of this. There are going to be some small towns in the Central Valley and in places where they rely upon well water for their very existence that I suspect are going to dry up and blow away. That's not going to happen to Los Angeles because it has the most political power and the most money in the state, and they're just not going to let themselves. No one's going to let LA dry up and blow away, but the practical short-term solution is pray for rain. That's
All right, well, thank you, everyone. I'd just like to remind you that directly outside these doors to your right, there are going to be books available for purchase, and also you can get them signed. Please just join me one more time in congratulating our great authors. Thank you.
I grew up not far from Cleveland. There's something of that same stuff.
Thank you.